Thanks, Kimberly, and hello, everybody. I can't actually see any of you today, so I'm just feeling like I'm talking to myself at the moment. But what you might see me do, so I'm going to go through a presentation for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. But what you'll see me doing is staring that direction. Doesn't mean I'm trying to avoid looking at you all. It just means I can't see you and I'm looking at the screen in front of me just now. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the screen and you'll see that this session is all about ORCID's privacy policy, and we're going to talk a little bit about privacy policy, but also a little bit about what we're doing with personal data here at ORCID. And get me started. Here's our agenda for the day. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of ORCID and privacy and how we got to where we are today. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about me and the data protection officer role at ORCID, what it's for, why we think it's a good thing, and so on. And then I'm going to talk about the types of things that I've been doing since joining ORCID a year ago, and specifically the ORCID privacy framework and why we're taking that kind of approach to how we improve our data protection practices. Then we'll go on to the kind of meat of today's session, which is all about talking about the new privacy policy, which hopefully some or all of you have seen that we've recently uploaded onto our website. Then we're going to talk a little bit about individual data protection rights, because I know that's something people quite often have questions about. And then we're going to talk again a little bit about privacy and security at ORCID, because you can't talk about one without talking about the other. Then finally, we'll go on to what's next, what's the plans for the next few months and into next year, and any questions that you might have at the end of the session. Okay. So we're going to start off with a poll, because it's good to get a sense of who I'm speaking to. So the first question is, how would you rate your data protection knowledge? And we've got ones ranging from expert level to pretty good, okay, or actually it's not my area of expertise, but I do have an interest in this subject. I'm hoping that you'll fit into one of these groups. Give you a few seconds just to pick one of those, and we'll see what the results are at the end. I'm sort of hoping you're not all experts, because it might make me a bit more nervous. Okay. What have we got? Well, we've got some experts. So hello to the experts. I hope I don't say anything terribly wrong during this, but you can pull me up on it later. As I sort of thought, we've got a lot of people who are, you're thereabouts, you know what you need to know for your particular role, I'm guessing. And you've got a good understanding of data protection as it applies to your area. And some people who you're saying it's not your area of expertise, but have an interest. Well, in this session, where I don't expect you to be experts on data protection or privacy. Hopefully I'll explain everything that I'm talking about as I go on, but again, just ask questions if not. Okay, thank you, Kimberly. I'm just going to close that just now. I'm going to go on to the next slide, and this is, I thought, be useful just to say, because we've got kind of two concepts here that we're going to be talking about, and you will find I tend to use the two terms interchangeably. So we talk about privacy or privacy, and again, I switch back and forward with how I pronounce these things, and data protection. And I thought it was useful because so as you might have guessed from my accent, I come from the UK, and we are very much in the kind of European way of thinking about data protection rather than privacy. Privacy is something that I suppose is growing. It seems to be, I guess, the way that it seems to me is that people talk about more about privacy in the US and other countries than they do in Europe. But I think there's some subtle differences there, and I do try to kind of pick out the differences as I talk. But I thought this would be useful just to say what I mean when I'm talking about one or the other. And I got this information from a site called Propel Forward. I don't know much about them other than the fact this seemed to make sense to my definitions. Other people may have different definitions, but what we're talking about when we're talking about privacy, we're talking about more about an individual, what the individual's rights are, what their personal control is about how their personal information is used. So their right to a private life, if you like. And so I see it as much more of a personal thing, whereas when we're talking about data protection, I see it much more of a legal obligations and processes things. So the laws that we have, say, in Europe or the UK, they set out things that we have to do to make sure we're protecting information, people's personal information, and therefore ensuring their privacy. So it might seem like a kind of a semantic something we're not really need to be worried about, but I just wanted to set it out at the start so you knew where I was coming from when I talk about one or the other. So to move on to just from that, just to go back a little bit in time to ORCID's history. Now, personally speaking, I can only go back a year because I haven't been with ORCID that long, but when you first start a job, and I'm sure you're all the same, you do a little bit of archaeology, you do a little bit of digging to see what's happened before your time there, what's the culture of the place been, what kind of things have happened. And one thing which is really good for my role, what I've been able to see is actually data protection has been taken seriously from the absolute get-go with ORCID, to the extent that it actually features, not explicitly, but implicitly in our founding principles, which you may be familiar with, but I've copied them out here on the screen so you can see. So numbers 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the founding principles talk about things that are really so familiar from a data protection perspective. In some cases, the wording is very similar to what we have in data protection legislation. So what we're talking about is our services being based on transparent and non-discriminatory terms, that people have the right to control the information that we hold about them, that they can change their privacy settings, and some information is going to be made public, but we do that subject to people's wishes. Now, this really is echoed in a lot of the privacy language that we talk about, that idea of choice, of trust, of fairness, and how we use personal data. So as far as I'm concerned, this is great because it means that from the start, ORCID's thinking about things I would be interested in, and I'm sure you're all interested in as well, about how we respect people's personal data. So this is all good stuff. So we can see that was when we were from the get-go. So we're thinking about 2012, that kind of time. But obviously things have changed over time. And one of the really notable things that's happened with ORCID is the fact that we have the data protection legislation. So do have to apologise. You might hear in the background I've got dogs, and they do tend to bark at this time of day, so I will try and ignore them. But if you hear them and if you see me closing the door, it's because they've started to bark at the moment. Bear with me. Right. Apologies for that. Okay, so the general data protection regulations, depending on where you are in the world, you may or may not have come across this before. The GDPR has become quite well known as sort of, I guess, a gold standard when it comes to data protection. And it was announced in about 2016. So, when ORCID was still quite new. And ORCID made the decision that actually, although we are a company based in the United States, and although this is a European legislation, that ORCID would take on the requirements of the GDPR. And so we took really quite extensive actions in preparation for the law, and the law coming into force, which it did in 2018. And I can see that going back in time through the documentation that we have, I can see that we sought legal advice. I can see that we brought in a contractor with sort of subject matter expertise, and that we did a fair amount of work to just make sure that we were meeting the legal requirements as we understood them at the time. And then, because these things don't stay still, I don't know if any of you were involved in GDPR when it first came in, but there was a lot of people treating it as one project that we would do something for, and then it would be done and we wouldn't have to worry about it again. That's not the case with personal data, because it changes. The way we use personal data changes over time. So the initial work that we'd done was revisited in 2021, 22, and the idea was that we would just fill in any gaps that we had in how we were managing personal data. So this kind of thing puts us in quite a good position to comply with all sorts of data protection laws across the world, and it puts us in a good position when we come to talking about what we do with personal data. But we need to think beyond the GDPR. It doesn't begin and end with that. It allows us to aim high, as I've said there, and it allows us to demonstrate that we're compliant in lots of ways with an internationally recognised privacy standard. But as I say, we're a US-based organisation, we're not European. Although the GDPR is appropriate to us in lots of ways, it might not be in sometimes, and we might have to think about local, United States laws or other laws that might apply. We also are a global organisation, so our services are offered worldwide, and we have international staff working for us, people from all parts of the world. So we need to look at privacy laws accordingly. And the other thing to say is that over the past few years, certainly since GDPR came in and before, we've had a proliferation of new data protection laws. And that although a lot of them say similar things, there's similar themes. So for example, the theme of transparency, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot today, is common across a whole load of different laws. There are things that we might need to be aware of, and we might need to watch so we don't get caught out by things in certain laws, particularly in the United States, where the laws are changing quite a lot. And another thing that is not unique to ORCID, but we have to think about a lot because of the nature of our organisation, is that transferring data across borders brings lots of complication with it. And anybody who's joined us from the EU or the UK will know, excuse me, that we have additional privacy complications and concerns about transferring data to the States. Excuse me. And then, of course, over time, we will all know, because we all see the headlines and the news stories, that security of data has become an ever bigger concern. It seems to me that you can't go a day without finding out about another security breach, another cyber attack, another hack of large organizations, to the extent that I think it's almost a when, not if situation with a lot of organizations now. So the GDPR being technologically neutral, it doesn't talk about certain things that, specific security measures that you have to take to protect data. It talks more generally about what you have to do, but we have to, alongside that, think about the security measures, the technical measures we need to take to protect data. So although we do follow the GDPR, the point of this slide is really saying it's not the only thing we think about. And there's other things that we do to demonstrate our commitment to privacy. So listed on the screen here, we've got the ORCID Trust Framework, which you can have a look at on our website, and the link is just at the bottom there. It's not all about data protection, obviously, or not specifically about that, but it does talk a lot about why this is important to us, especially this concept of individual control over what happens to your data and what you can do with it, what you can make public and what you can choose to make private. So these are all, as I say, very common data protection themes there, and it is worth having a look to see what we say about this. We also, as an organisation in the United States, we also have trustee certification, which you may or may not have come across before, but it is a programme that's run by a company called TrustArc, and we are currently a participant in their Verified International Privacy Programme. And what this does, and you can see the privacy seal for that on our privacy notice, privacy policy. And what this does is it confirms that we've met a certain standard in the way that we manage personal data. And those standards, although they are TrustArc requirements, they are based on the EU-US data privacy framework, which is the certification scheme that facilitates transfer of personal data from the EU, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and other parts of the world, and Switzerland, to the United States. So it makes sure that we're meeting a certain standard. And a lot of that is to do with what we tell people about how we're using their personal data. So that is it's an interesting thing for me anyway. It's interesting because we can't, because of the type of organisation that ORCID is, we can't specifically sign up to the framework, the EU-US data privacy framework directly, but the trustee certification allows us to evidence that we're meeting that standard. Other things we do, we have ongoing security improvements. This is something you would expect, I'm sure, of an organisation like ours, that we're always thinking about what can we do to make our services, our data, our technology more secure. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And also, as we see here, we've got a dedicated data protection officer. So I'm going to go and talk a little bit more about that, which sounds very much like I'm sort of blowing my own trumpet. I don't mean it that way. I'm not trying to kind of promote myself here, nor do I think that you've come to this session to find out all about me, but I thought it would be useful just to tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am now. So what I have is a lot of years and years of experience in the side of the information management broadly, I suppose you would say. So just about everything I've done since graduating has been something to do with how we manage information. And quite often there's been a bit of a tension between giving information and being that type of person that wants to make information available to people, and also being on the organizational side of things, the person that says, actually, we can't make that publicly available or available to a specific person. So there's been that kind of backwards and forwards in my career. But I started off, I suppose, as an academic librarian. So I've done a lot of work in universities in the UK over the years, starting off in libraries. And then just as ORCID was, was becoming widely known, I moved over into the dark side of compliance. And I started working on data protection work and also freedom of information work in the UK. And I've been doing that ever since. And I've led on the GDPR implementation for 2 universities and embedding the GDPR in 2 different universities. And through that time, as you can imagine, you pick up other things. I'm not, and I should hold my hands up and say I'm not necessarily the most technical person in the world, but I have worked a lot with technical specialists, especially on the cybersecurity side of things, and also academic researchers as well. So I hope that all these things help when I'm trying to kind of get my head around what ORCID does and how it does it. So as I said there, it means that ORCID kind of made sense to me when I joined a year ago. Although, as I'm sure you all know, when you join an organisation, you think you've got a handle on what we're doing, but then you realise it's a lot more complicated than you might think at first glance. So some benefits, and again, this makes it look like I'm talking about how great it is to have a data protection officer, but actually these are the things I think that again, it's a benefit for ORCID. We didn't need to, as an organisation, we probably didn't need to hire someone specifically to do data protection, but there are actually benefits, and it shows that how seriously we take it. The benefits of having a DPO in-house, a data protection officer in-house, is that expertise. So it means that any of my colleagues can come and ask me about things if they have any questions about how to manage personal data. And I guess it means that we can improve our efficiency and responsiveness. So say, for example, we want to work with a new software provider. It means that we can do that data protection work quite quickly and in-house without having to be too concerned about bringing in legal expertise every single time. So it improves our efficiency as an organisation, I would hope. And it means that we can prioritise data protection rather than having it as something that people do when they've got time or in addition to their day job, because everybody's busy. So make sure, by having someone who's dedicated to this work, it means that we can be consistent in how we approach things and just make general incremental improvements, because it's never done. The work that you need to do for privacy and data protection is never completely done. There's always something else. And it just means that we can keep that focus over time and just keep on top of changes that happen. So changes to the law. Hopefully there's a lot of changes that go on, but hopefully we can keep track of them and make sure that we're not missing anything when we're working with people across the globe. So one of the things I've been doing since I started at ORCID is thinking about a data privacy framework as a way of making sure we're working in a structured and accountable and visible way of making sure that we're promoting what we're doing with personal data, making sure people can understand that. So when I first started, I was thinking, well, actually, this looks like quite a serious slide there, and it's possibly overstating things just to call it a problem, because actually, in terms of comparison with other places I've worked, ORCID is really pretty good in terms of its culture. People tend to be focused on privacy and how we manage data. They don't tend to gobble up lots of data that they don't need to. That's not something we do as an organisation, and that we do have these good data protection practices. But the downside of that is that if we wanted to make progress, it was generally, as far as I could tell from what I've seen and who I've spoken to, it was led by projects. So we would do a bit and then move on, and then do another bit and then move on. And sometimes our initiatives would be a bit ad hoc and not necessarily completely joined up, although they were also good things. And it's slightly difficult to evidence what we've done. So say, for example, when we're doing the TrustArc certification, the Trust E certification, we have to evidence how we were complying with the law, and having the documentation was a little bit of a challenge just to get that all together in the first instance. And as I've said, we're working in a complex global landscape, and there's lots of things that we need to take into consideration. So what I proposed as being a good way to resolve that situation is to look at a recognised and appropriate privacy framework or data protection framework, whatever you want to call it. And that would provide structure to what we're doing, and it would also pull it all together, pull all these little bits and pieces that we've been doing together and make it easier to evidence. And again, it helps with the transparency of what we're actually doing and making sure that people can understand that we're taking this seriously. So what were we looking at when we were thinking about a privacy framework? We were thinking that we didn't want it to be a tick box approach, just something that was done for the sake of doing it. We needed it to be customizable with defined outcomes, and that we were able to prioritize our work. So ideally not aligned to a specific bit of legislation, because as we said, there's lots of legislation we need to consider, but the framework should be reputable. So what did we come up with? Well, actually, first of all, we've got a question, because some of you might have worked with privacy frameworks in your own place of work, and I'm just a bit curious. This is really a question for me as much as anybody else, is really to get an understanding of, have you introduced this kind of thing at your organisation, and if so, how has it worked for you? So you might think, yes, you know that there's a privacy framework in use and you've used it and it works well, or it was tried but it didn't work. Or perhaps where you're considering it, or perhaps you're going, no, I don't need this. This doesn't make any sense to me. So tell me what you think anyway. I'd be interested to find out. And again, I'll give you a minute or two to do that. Okay. Okay, so we've got some people saying, yeah, you've got one in place and it works well for you. So I'm really hoping that you've picked the same one as I'm about to tell you about. Interestingly, that you've said you do have one, and 47% of you do have one, but it wasn't fully implemented or widely adopted. That's really interesting to know. And again, we've got some people saying no, and some people saying you haven't got it, but you're thinking about it. So if you wanted to talk more about that, or tell me what your good things and bad things, that'd be really good to know about. But I can tell you what we've gone with here, or what we're planning to go with here, is the NIST framework, which you might be familiar with, especially if you're from the United States, because it's a United States organization. And I always forget what NIST stands for, but Institute of something in technology. I should have memorized this, but I always forget it. But anyway, it's a privacy framework. It's not the only thing they do by any stretch, but they're, I suppose, better known probably for having a cybersecurity framework, but they also have a privacy framework, and they also more recently have an AI framework as well. And the idea being that it's a standard that we can, Julie's just put in the chat there, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, I think that is, I can't see the whole thing. So it gives us a standard, it gives us something to work to from a reputable organisation that we can say, actually, this is how we're operating and how we're doing against these measures. So more will be to come from that. And I'll not talk about this too much, because you can actually go to their website. There's loads of information if you're interested in that. And the link is just on the screen there. So what's our progress been like so far? Well, having done the investigation to what I thought would be useful, and having had that approved, actually progress has been pretty slow over the past few months. I should say that I am part-time, and it's my first time I've worked in a part-time role for a very long time. So sometimes I have this idea that I can possibly do a little bit more than I actually get done. And this has been the case with the NIST work. But I have been focused on doing some of our documentation and completing outstanding work, and this is all going to feed into it anyway, so it's all makes sense. But over time, what we want to do is to have closer alignment with the framework and to be able to demonstrate that as well. But all this stuff about frameworks, you might be thinking, what's the point? Especially those of you who said that your organisation hasn't really adopted them or hasn't really implemented it, because a framework's great and it can say that you're doing things, but actually you still need to be responsive. If something happens, you need to move with the changes, and you can't be just too bound by processes and very rigid in how you do things. So although we've got this framework, it won't be the only thing that we're doing. We'll still be making sure that we're being responsive to what the data protection needs of the organisation are. So, okay, on to the main thing that we wanted to talk about today, which is the ORCID privacy policy. Another question, just making sure that you're keeping awake through this. So, and this is one to be really honest about, especially for those of you who work in this area. Do you always read organisations' privacy policies or privacy notices? First one says, of course I do, every single time. And the second one says, you'll read them if you feel you need to, for example, for work or personal reasons. Maybe you only read them if you've got a complaint or concern about the organisation. And maybe you go, no way, never read them, scroll through, tick accept. That's all I do with them. So you might be any one of these. And I'll give it a second. Okay, I'm interested to see what people say. Wow, a whole 6% of you do it every single time. You read every single one, every single time. That's impressive, I have to say. And what else have we got? So we've got 58% saying that you read them if you feel you need to. And I think that's probably fair. I think that's, excuse me, roughly where I thought people would be. Those brave 12% of you at the bottom saying, no way, who has time for that? Yeah, I also have sympathy, especially if you have, say, for example, the Apple or Microsoft ones where you just scroll for ages until eventually you can get through and click through to the bit that you actually need to get to. They're interesting. It's interesting to hear that not all of you are reading them all the time. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so, and that brings us on to, I suppose, the elephant in the room, as you might call it, the problem that we might have with privacy policies. They are great. I love a privacy policy. Obviously, I do. It's my job to. But are they fun to read? Not normally. They're not something that you would necessarily choose as bedtime reading. But do we want people to read them? Do we need people to read them? Actually, yes, we do. But do we think they do? Probably not in lots of cases. And the screenshots that you can see there actually give a good example of that. So this was on the BBC website a few months ago. And what it was is it was the Tax Policy Associates. They had a privacy policy that they'd published. And in that policy, they said that hidden away in the small print was that the first person to spot this thing would get a bottle of fine wine or good wine. And it took them, they added it in February, and it took them until May before someone spotted that this was in their notice. So it was a bit cynical of them to do that, but you know, whoever it was that got the bottle of free wine out of it was probably quite pleased. But it sort of illustrates an issue that we might have with them, that they become, in lots of cases, documents that are a tick box. You know, we need to have it. We're going to have a policy, but we're not really worried about whether it's interesting or anybody reads it. I don't really like privacy policies are like that. You know, you actually want them, if you're going to spend a lot of time, and organizations do spend a lot of time on doing them, you want it to be something people actually read. But this is a good indication that they don't. And unfortunately, this is not me trying to tell you that there's a secret offer in our own privacy policy, because unfortunately, I can tell you right now there isn't. But I was very tempted to do this, to do that when I read this article earlier in the year. So why do we think they're important? Well, I suppose I'll take the bottom point there first of all. It's our shop window. From a data protection or a privacy point of view, the policy is where it's at. It's where we have our opportunity to say to the world, this is what we do with your data. We take it seriously, and this is how we take it seriously. So if you've just got a raggedy old PDF that was last updated in 2014, it doesn't say a huge amount about how seriously you take privacy as an organization. Even if you do take it really seriously, people aren't necessarily going to think that. So for us, that's one of the things that we want to do. We want to say to people, look, hey, it's important, have a look at this. And actually, because of if you think, go back to our founding principles and our values, we want to be open and transparent with what we're doing. And we've got nothing to hide. We can just tell you what we're doing with personal data. We know we've got these legal obligations to fulfill as well, so we shouldn't forget that, because especially when we think about the GDPR, there are very specific things that we have to tell people about in that legislation. So we need to make sure we've got all these things covered as well. And we see it as a resource. So that I think probably in my experience, the way that people use these policies most often, unless they're working in this particular area, is that they want to find out about their rights, or they want to use it as a resource to tell people about. And these are all good reasons why we need to have a good policy in place as well. Why did we want to do a full review and rewrite now? Well, I mean, part of it is because I joined, and that was one of the first things that I wanted to get done, was to look at not just our externally facing privacy policy, but also our employee one as well, which we've updated this year, but actually the last revisions to our privacy policy were in 2021. So we were really overdue a look at it anyway. And as it says there, we had the time and the resource to do it, which sounds a bit cynical, but actually in a practical world, it's a difficult thing to get to because, as I say, it's a big bit of work. Sometimes with the best will in the world, you don't get to the privacy policy because you think, I've got it and it's 99% there. It just needs a little bit of work. But actually, in this case, we had the time to sit back and go, is this still reflecting what we're doing with personal data? And then we knew that we had other things we wanted to tell people about. And the example I've given there is events. So something like this, we're gathering a small amount of personal data about individuals when we do these kind of events, when we run these kind of events. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't focusing too much on just one aspect of what we're doing, which is previously we focused really primarily on the registry and how we use personal data within that. Completely understandable, but it's not everything that we do. So we needed to make sure we were telling people about everything we did. The other thing to note is that not everything we do is based on gathering people's consent for using their personal data. We try and do that wherever it's feasible and possible to do that, but sometimes we just have to collect data because we need a small amount of data for our work. So again, the example I've given there is providing technical support to people. We need to know who you are. If you're asking us for help with your ORCID record, say, we need to know a little bit of information about you to do that. And again, that wasn't really reflected in our notice as it stood, or privacy policy as it stood. And over time, like with anything, there tends to be a generally accepted practice, what's good and what's bad in terms of privacy policies. And we knew that since the first flush of GDPR, where everybody started writing these things, that things had moved on. So we needed to keep ourselves up to date as well and make sure we were reflecting what normally would people expect to see about in these policies. And also, and this is more from my perspective, privacy policies, or writing a privacy policy, is a really good way to check what you're doing, check your understanding about what's happening in an organization. Because when we were doing this rewrite, we worked with all the different areas of ORCID, all the different people in ORCID, to just check that what we think we're doing is what we're doing, and we could tell people about all the different data uses that we have. So when we were writing the notice, in the back of my head, what I was thinking was that really these points here. So we wanted it to be comprehensive. So I said everything we were doing with personal data needed to be in there. There needed to be nothing that we'd left behind, no hidden data uses that we'd forgotten to add in. So comprehensive explanation of what we do with people's information. I wanted it to be clear. Now, everybody's idea of what's clear can vary, but in my head, that meant it was the wording, that we weren't using a lot of legalese, a lot of terms that wouldn't make sense to your average person. It needed to be logically structured. So again, you might have a different view of that, but for me, that I think if I think about a privacy policy as something that a data subject, an individual whose data that we're using, would go to in a time where they had confusion or concern about what we were doing, then I wanted to give prominence to their rights to say, actually, this is how you find out if this is your relationship with ORCID, this is how we use your personal data. So to try and make it structured in such a way that it was easy to find that out. And then to meet the expectations of all our community, because we'll have people across the world in different places that will need to know different things. If you're in the UK, for example, you might be interested to find out where our data lives, where's our data go across the world. And that's the kind of thing we can tell you in the privacy policy. So make sure that we're covering all the needs in that regard. Did we manage to get that way? So what we hope you get from the privacy policy is we're reiterating the fact that as far as possible, we're going to put choice and control in your hands, that you will, if you're a record holder, you have that control over your data as it appears in the registry. If it's not possible to have that direct control, if it's not possible to make those changes yourself, we still want you to be empowered and knowledgeable about how we use your data. And the policy will help with this. So it takes things that might not have been so visible, like, for example, registration for one of these events, and makes it more visible, more explicit about what happens with your data. So we want you to know about your rights and how we're going to uphold them. And we want you to engage with us if you want to. You know, by all means, you don't need to, but if you want to comment or question anything we do with personal data, then you can get in touch with us. And again, as I said earlier on, we want it to be a resource that you can refer back to as and when you need to. So we hope we've got that. But did we achieve all these aims? Well, I mean, you can be the judge of that, but the things I think about it, I think that we are just about there. You know, we've done, I think, a lot of improvements, but at the end of the day, it is still quite a long and dry document, I have to admit. Apologies again if you can hear dog barking. But the thing I can say about it, although it's long, it is comprehensive. So, you know, I'm confident that we've captured the things that we're doing as things stand. Hopefully it's clear, but as I say, not a huge amount of fun to read. And we're meeting all the legal obligations that we know of, but privacy laws are changing, and there's probably still, I would admit, even I can hear it in how I'm talking to you today, I'm referring to the United States, I'm referring to the European Union, and actually there's a lot more that we need to be taking into consideration. So that make sure we're not emphasizing that too much, and hopefully over time we can make any corrections that we need. So did we achieve our aims? I'd say we're nearly there, but we've certainly got a very strong foundation to work from. But that's what I think, and yet another poll. What do you think about it? So if you've had a chance to read it, I'd be really interested to know, do you like it? Have you read it? Do you intend to read it? Do you think we can make improvements, or do you really not like it? Really good if you could tell us what you think. And again, I'll give you a minute, just as the dogs stop barking. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to vote. Okay, well, thank you to the people that said you really like it. That's great. And for the people who haven't read it, but you will, fantastic. I'm really pleased to hear that nobody really dislikes it. So that's quite nice of you. So there will always be improvements. There'll always be something, if and when you do get a chance to read it, that you'll go, I'm not sure about that. And if there is, tell us about it. Again, you might not feel moved to comment on a privacy policy normally, but I would ask if there is anything that you see that you think not quite sure about that, then tell us, and you can email us at privacy@orcid.org if you do have any comments or questions about it. Good. Well, I hope that gives a little bit more of the background about why we got to the privacy policy, why we're doing it, how we've taken the approach that we have. And it is on our website, so you can see it at any time. It's always on the bottom of the website, a link to it. Before I leave you, though, I just wanted to talk about a couple of other things very briefly that I think people quite often have questions about. The first one being about data protection rights. Really not to sort of do anything other than to make you aware of the fact that we know that people have certain rights under various data protection legislation. So that might be the right to object to how we're using personal data. It might be the right to have a copy of personal data that we hold about you, or the right to have data erased, for example. There's a range of rights. And what we've done is we've taken all the GDPR rights that there's quite a wide range of rights you get under that legislation. And we've also added in some of the more recent rights that certain states in the United States, certain laws that they have, add to those rights as well. So we've added them in. And our aim is that regardless of where you are in the world, if we are able to do so, we'll uphold the rights that we've got listed in our privacy policy. So we're wanting to be as inclusive as possible and give people as high a standard as we can do in terms of relation to their rights. Wherever we can, we're going to make it self-service, so you can see what we hold about you. You can change your privacy settings on your record, for example, and that we'll try not to put bureaucratic barriers in people's way if they want to exercise their data protection rights. Where we can do, we'll just handle a request informally, and we'll only go the formal, these are your rights, and this is what we're going to do, all the sort of the full GDPR formalities, for example, when there's no other reasonable option to do that. So, for example, if someone asks us for a copy of the personal data, we are going to ask for evidence of who that person is so we can be sure that we're giving data to the right person. Hopefully that doesn't seem too bureaucratic. That's a kind of protection that we would put in place rather than a barrier. But the idea being that it's self-service where we can. And we will be as fair and transparent as we can. If we can fulfill your request, we will. If we can't, we'll tell you why we can't and give you an explanation of why and any routes that you might want to take to escalate that complaint. If you want to exercise your rights, or if you want to tell people about how they can exercise their data rights, there is lots of guidance on our web pages already that you can have a look at. But really, if you contact that email address there, I can answer any questions that you might have about data protection rights that people have. So that's privacy@orcid.org. And a little bit about security, because as I say there, you can't do privacy without security. The worlds overlap. The terminology is very similar. Information security or cybersecurity and data protection, to the greatest extent, they're going to mean the same things to most people. I think of them as being slightly different, and a cybersecurity expert might think of them as being slightly different. But actually, as I've said there, while you can do, as an organization, you can do security with no personal data, you cannot do data protection without secure technologies and operational measures that you might take to protect data. So we need the security aspect of it in order to protect personal data. So you'll be pleased to hear that we do both. So my role is primarily not technical, although I might work with technical experts, but we're also running alongside the work that I'm doing, a cybersecurity program of work, and the work that I'm doing and the work that they're doing will inform and strengthen each other and the other. So by focusing on cybersecurity and data protection, we'll hopefully be in a much better situation than if we just did one or the other. It's also not all about the technology. There's a temptation, I think, when people think about cybersecurity in particular, that it's all about technology and you can just fix security with technology. That's not always or even often the case. A lot of times it's the human that sometimes can be the weakest link in the chain, as they might say. So what we try to do as an organization is that we have a culture, a security-aware, a privacy-aware culture, and that we have training that we give to people as well. So the people are the key to making sure that we've got data protection and security sorted. But these are both works in progress. So this slide is really to say, don't ask me any really technical questions, but also that we are bearing in mind that there's the two-pronged approach that we need to take. So what's next? Well, very briefly, where we want to go, this is a little bit of, it's not a formal mission statement, this by any stretch, but this is me where I'm thinking and from the privacy side of things, where do we need to be as an organization? Well, we're committed to it. So we're committed to upholding privacy rights and to the protection of personal data in our care. And what we aim to do is to understand and respect the privacy needs of all of our users, all of our employees, and all of our other stakeholders that we have. So that's broadly, very high level where we want to be. But how are we going to get there in the short to medium term? Well, we're going to keep working on the NIST privacy framework that I mentioned earlier on. We're going to maintain that focus and maintain that culture that understands and respects and values personal data. We're going to keep up to date with changes as and when they happen to data protection laws, and they do happen. And also just keep listening. So if you have any questions or thoughts after this session or during this session, let me know. If you have any suggestions of how we can improve how we're managing personal data or what we're telling people about that, do let me know, because I'd be very interested to hear. And all the polls that we've been doing today, they've been very helpful for me to just get a sense where people are as well. Which brings the presentation bit to an end. And any questions? Kimberly.
Yes, well, firstly, thank you, Ellen, for such a wonderful presentation. Very informative. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to submit their questions to the Q&A. In the meantime, I do want to share next Wednesday, we have a special ORCID in the Wild webinar, dropping a link to it in the chat, featuring FCT, which is a funder in Portugal. And you really want to hear about how they've adopted ORCID and integrated with our systems and the way it's made life for their researchers and everyone so much easier. So please join us for that next week. We've got a couple of questions. First, I think, Ellen, someone was just looking for a little bit of clarification on something you said towards the end there.
Mhm.
Um, can you clarify a bit what it means to say to meet legal requirements, but not to be too legalistic?
Oh yeah, no. So what that meant was that so that was in reference to the language in the privacy policy. So there's certain things under the GDPR, for example, that we have to tell people about. So these are legal requirements. But what I meant by not being too legalistic was saying that we don't necessarily want to use really legal or GDPR specific language. We want it to be just plain old language that anybody would understand if they don't have a legal degree or a data protection speciality. That's the aim. You can tell me if we've achieved that, though.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks for clarifying that. And then while we're speaking of legal and legalities, I was just wondering, we've mentioned it a bit that we as ORCID employees, we're a fully remote organization, so we're stationed around the globe. And then we also serve a global audience. And how do you stay up to date on various legislation that's coming up around the world and implement it within ORCID?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I suppose the approach that we have taken, which makes complete sense, is you aim for the highest. So you aim for the most stringent, the strictest laws, and then you hope that everything else that comes in underneath, you're going to be in a good place to meet that anyway. And that's the approach that we've taken since before I started with GDPR. But as I mentioned earlier on, there are little things that come in that might trip us up over time. So I do a lot of reading. There are some really good resources out there that keep track of the different laws in, say, for example, the United States. There's law trackers for privacy laws there, and worldwide, there's some really good resources that tell you how strict the laws are, what things you might need to be aware of, how you can find out more information. If you're really interested in that kind of thing, there's a website called DLA Piper that's an excellent resource if you want to find out just a kind of snapshot of privacy laws across the world.
Thanks, Ellen. Our next question, I've got some insight from one of our senior team members that I'm happy to answer with, and then Ellen, if you have anything to follow up with. The question is, how do you avoid paper mills registering for an ORCID? Do we verify individuals such as LinkedIn and Facebook, how they use national IDs and such? So firstly, to address the paper mills obtaining an ORCID, we rely on our community to inform us of when they suspect a fraudulent record. So it's per our terms of service, ORCID records are for individuals, and the data that they should add should be true to the best of their knowledge. So if that's not the case and a dispute is lodged, we will lock the record pending correction or withdrawal. And we also have a machine learning algorithm to detect spam that locks a number of records every week. So we do rely on the community to help spot those things. And if you see something, let us know. But we take measures on our side as well. Ellen, anything to add on that part?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty comprehensive and a better answer than I would probably have given.
And then as far as verifying individuals in the similar way as LinkedIn and Facebook do using national ID verification, no, we don't do that. When it comes to observing someone's ORCID record and trying to determine, is this, legit? Can this be trusted? What we're hoping, what we hope is as we develop more integrations with our members and different services, that trusted data is being added to records, which further verifies and provides validity to what a person is doing or says they're doing. And then additionally, per our principles of researcher control, record holders can keep a number of items in their record private, which is something that we advocate for and think is important. And it really depends on your particular use case, whether or not the data displayed in the record is satisfactory for their use case. So we have a record summary at the top of the record that can be expanded to see if there are any trust markers available, which is that data that other verified sources add to your record, such as affiliations or verified email domains. And thank you, Paloma. She's also added some further insight here in the Q&A to help with that. And we do encourage record holders to make their data public, but it's also up to each individual. It's an option how public or private you want to make your data. Anything you want to add to that, Ellen? Otherwise, I've got another question for you.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Again, it's that there's that concept and the ideas of choice and control that people have. So yeah, although we benefit a lot if people make their data public, it is an individual choice.
Exactly. And someone had asked previously in the registration, what sort of information should I make private and what should I keep hidden? Whether you're asking on your ORCID record or just generally on the internet, that's up to personal preference.
Absolutely, and everybody has, it's just the same way as everybody sees privacy as a different thing, but how it relates to them. Some people see some type of information as private and not other type of information. It's a personal choice, but the idea is that you are in control of it. So even if you change your mind somewhere down the line, you can make those changes to your record.
Exactly. We do still have a few more minutes for questions, so please feel free to submit. Another question that I had, Ellen, you've been with us for a year now, and is there anything within your role that you have found unique or challenging or surprising that you hadn't encountered previously?
I think that the fact, and I don't know if people are aware of this, that we're fully remote, so that we could be anywhere at any time in the world. Actually, that's probably been the biggest challenge, because even though I've been, like a lot of people, working mostly remotely since the pandemic, just having that fully remote nature of the organization, that's probably been the biggest change for me. And that's, I suppose it's more of a personal thing and less of a privacy thing, but it does change how we interact with each other, I suppose, and what information we make available to each other as an organization. So I'm not sure that's particularly privacy related, but that's for me probably been the most interesting thing, or most unusual thing, I would say.
For sure. And then given that we represent so many different countries, just as a staff, have you had to look into specific policies or legislation in areas that you hadn't considered before?
Yeah, Canada. Canada has not come across my radar in my previous roles at all. So that's been quite interesting, and just finding out what I am by no means an expert in Canadian data protection law, but I know where to look now, which has been really helpful. And I think the people that we work with, they're members and various stakeholders, they are really helpful as well in giving us guidance. And that was certainly the case in the example that I'm thinking of. I got some good pointers of where to look.
That's interesting. I hadn't expected Canada to be too different from Europe or the UK, to be honest. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to hear. And then I guess just looking ahead, you kind of said what's ahead for ORCID. But generally, do you see any major privacy or security concerns ahead, or maybe even things that will benefit us in the future? Or, as is the hot topic lately, how do you see AI impacting data security or privacy at all?
Potentially, I think what I'm seeing is, and actually it's something that I'm working on just now, is an AI policy and procedures for ORCID. But what I'm seeing is a lot of people in my line of work are getting involved in the AI side of things, because there's such a lot of overlap. And again, it's that checks and balances and trying to make sure that you're not running away with people's personal data and starting to use data to train AI models and all these kind of things that people are just a little bit scared about at the moment. So it's trying to make sure that whatever we do, we're doing it in a proportionate way. We're not doing anything crazy or unusual with personal data that we weren't doing before. And if we do use personal data, say, for example, in relation to generative AI, that we're incredibly careful about how we do that. We put all the same kind of protections in place that we would for anything else that we do. So there's lots, I think there's opportunities for all organizations that, we've all had a play about with ChatGPT and things like that, and there's certainly things that it can do that are good, but we need to be aware of the risks that potentially involved there as well, not just to personal data, but to things like copyright, intellectual property, and all that kind of thing as well. Security is always a concern for anybody who works in my area. Is going to say the same thing. There's just a lot of things that do go wrong in all organizations with personal data, from the very, very small, human error data breaches that we all see, to the big cyber attacks. That's always something that's going to be a concern. But as I say, we are taking steps to put ourselves in the best possible position.
That's very good and reassuring to hear. On a personal note, I've gotten 3 letters just this year alone about various different data breaches I've been a part of, which is never something fun you want to get in the mail.
Yeah, absolutely. They can be really stressful when that kind of thing happens.
Well, Ellen, I really want to thank you for your presentation today and also all your wonderful contributions to ORCID. I really appreciate you sharing with our community all the good work that you're doing for us. And I thank everyone who joined us today, and we hope to see you at a future webinar.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And apologies again for the dogs barking.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.